I want to welcome everyone. It's good to see such a diverse crowd. I see students of mine, current and former, and a lot of faculty, and also it looks like a lot of community members too. So that's always good to see. My name is, and yes, especially from our Adventures in Lifelong Learning. My name is Steve Bufel. I'm a professor of sociology here, and I'm co-chair of our Learning Across the Board committee, which helps choose our annual academic theme, which this year and next year is Myths and Legends, and we plan different events and activities and talks around the theme each year to try to promote learning outside the classroom and across different disciplines. And so with financial support from our Three Rivers Foundation, we're very happy to have Professor Maria Tatar presenting first today. This is part of the Booker DeVaughn Lecture Series, which is sponsored by Dime Bank. So I want to acknowledge them and thank them for their support. Professor Tatar drove down from Cambridge today. She's a professor at Harvard in folklore, mythology, Germanic languages and literature. And she has done research on modern German culture, folklore, and children's literature, and she's received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. She has written books and articles about Weimar culture, the Brothers Grimm, authors of numerous of our fairy tales, we don't take for granted, Hans Christian Andersen, and just the joys of childhood reading. One of her recent books is in our library, Enchanted Hunters, the joys of childhood reading. She's also written in magazines we are more familiar with, like the New York Times and the New Republic. She's also often featured on public radio, NPR, and on the Today Show. She's a very prominent author and respected researcher and academic in this field. Her talk today is called Wired for Weirdness, How Fairy Tales Work Their Magic, and she will focus on the origins of fairy tales in oral storytelling cultures and our compulsion of cultural repetition when it comes to stories that we all know, like Little Red Riding Hood and Beauty and the Beast and Sleeping Beauty, that helps keep these stories alive and new in our culture. So please join me in welcoming Professor.
I wonder, is my mic working? Oh, good. Okay, so you can all hear me. Thank you for coming out today on such a beautiful spring day. I'm honored to be giving this lecture today. And I want to thank the Connecticut State Police who planted themselves in locations where I was going 65 miles an hour. So I'm relieved that I was not flagged. I thought I'd left myself plenty of time, but of course you never do. So here we are today, and I want to focus on fairy tales and how they're wired for weirdness. I'll explain that in a moment. But I'll begin with a meditation on storytelling, on the beautiful lies that we tell each other and that we use to pass on wisdom, to entertain each other, to instruct each other. And then we'll talk about the origins of fairy tales, moving us from the fireside to Kindle Fire, and those places, those new sites of storytelling that we have. And then finally, I'm going to close with a look at, just brief snapshots, I'm afraid, at Little Red Riding Hood, at, let's see, Beauty and the Beast, and Sleeping Beauty. And maybe in the discussion, we can talk about those stories at greater length. So, as I said, I want to begin with, I'm terrible at multitasking, but I will try. I'm going to begin with storytelling and with my colleague at Harvard, my emeritus colleague at Harvard, E.O. Wilson. who wrote a wonderful book called The Social Conquest of Earth, in which he tells us that storytelling is not just important for the human mind, it is the human mind. And I remember reading that at one point and realizing that even at night, we tell ourselves stories. That our brains are, there's not only a language instinct, but there's also a storytelling instinct. And what do we do at night? We take bits and pieces of everyday reality, stitch them together into a symbolic narrative, and I don't know, we keep ourselves asleep. Usually we think of a story as waking us up, but somehow that dreaming keeps us asleep, lets us finish our thoughts. So these are stories with what I call a high coefficient of weirdness, with more than a touch of the supernatural. And that's precisely what got me interested in them, that is their pathology. They're strange stories, so that we get something like all furs, 1,000 furs. There she is dressed up in pelts. She's put together the pelts of many different animals. There's the talking wolf, the Little Red Riding Hood, the strange witch in the woods. And what is extraordinary, the touch of magic there, is that the house is made of bread, the windows are made of spun sugar. There's Vasilisa, if some of you know Russian folklore, with her strange hut with skulls on the fence post, a house that sits on chicken legs, and all sorts of strange things going on. And some of you may recognize the ogre in Little Tom Thumb, who is getting ready to cut the throats of what he thinks are the intruders, the boys who have been the intruders, but in fact they're his own daughters. And then we have the steadfast tin soldier, Hans Christian Andersen, where we're moving into a slightly different domain, the literary fairy tale. So I think that we often underestimate the value of fairy tales because of the misleading name given to the genre. There are, of course, fairy tales. I mean, it sounds odd. It sounds like something for children. And of course, there are other cultural vectors that come into play. For example, the 20th century Disneyfication of fairy tales, where these stories morphed into cartoon versions of themselves. So frivolous, juvenile, shallow, inconsequential. All of those connotations, I think, are captured in the dismissive phrase, that's just a fairy tale. That's just a myth, by the way, is also a phrase that we use. And of course, myths, how could we get along without them? The sprightly supernatural figures that feature so prominently in the name fairy tales, they actually rarely make an appearance in the stories themselves. There aren't any in any of the stories up here, illustrated here. And it was the French, more specifically Madame d'Aulnoy, who gave us the term conte de fées, leading us to frame the stories as if they turn on the lives of diminutive creatures, stories about fairies. So what is a fairy tale? And I could go on and on about this, but just two features that I think are important to keep in mind in the context of what I'll be talking about today. And that is magic and also metamorphosis. These are stories that also have a whiff of the mythical, but I'm going to leave that out of the mix for now. I always give my students the 5 or 6 M's: magical, mythical, migratory, metamorphic, and metaphorical. It's an easy mnemonic. The presence of magic, of enchantment, is probably the defining feature of the genre. We're in the realm of what Tolkien referred to as fairy, F-A-E-R-I-E. That perilous realm, as he called it, where anything can happen. This is the place of the great what-ifs, not or else, as is the case with much of children's literature in the 19th century, where you had all kinds of lessons being taught. But here we're opening the gates to anything. Anything is possible. So Hansel and Gretel discover this, the witch in the house in the woods. There's a skull in African American folklore. There's a skull lying in the woods that begins to talk. A boy sails down the river in a peach. Some of you may know the story of Momotaro. No one is ever shocked and startled by the presence of magic. It's not like fantasy where everybody's saying what's going on, and there's Alice falls down the rabbit hole, and immediately there's disorientation. In the fairy tale, the supernatural is just accepted as part and parcel of reality. So you're never rubbing your eyes in disbelief in a fairy tale. What happens is we have not just a touch of magic, but also the notion of metamorphosis writ large. Again and again, we witness transformations that break down the divide between life and death, nature and culture, animal and human, or self and other. Metamorphosis, of course, implies magic. So presto, we can see the clear link between the two defining features of the fairy tale. Magic enabling metamorphosis. So fairy tales habitually bend the rules, suspend the laws, and misrepresent reality, giving us fabrications, deceptions, and lies, or what Zora Neale Hurston called big old lies, lies above suspicion. Some of you know that Zora Neale Hurston was getting her PhD at Columbia, working with Boas, and what did she do? She got into a used car. She bought a used car with her fellowship money, got in and went south, went back home to collect folk tales, many of which then are in Mules and Men. So I want to move to this connection between storytelling and lying, misrepresentation. And here we have Vladimir Nabokov, a card-carrying lepidopterist. Butterflies are everywhere in his work. And he tells us that fiction was born on the day when a boy came home crying wolf, and there was no wolf behind him. And, imagine, he tells us that all great novels are fairy tales. And I had to suspend disbelief when I read that. And then suddenly Lolita, you read Lolita and you discover that it's full of fairy tale tropes, but also fairy tale plot structures. So that he was drawing heavily on those big old lies. But lies make-believe is closely connected, I think, also with the making of beliefs. And here we have one of my favorite authors, Neil Gaiman, telling us that we who make stories, and notice how he uses the word make, that is the idea of fabrication, that somehow he's creating an artifact. He doesn't position himself as a writer genius. We make stories. We know we tell lies for a living. They're good lies, they say true things, and we want to build them as best we can. Build them as best we can. Again, this idea of constructing things, putting things together. All storytellers are bricoleurs, what Levi-Strauss called bricoleurs. They put bits and pieces of borrowed things together. And then he tells us about how this story will become important for someone. It will give them hope or wisdom or kindness or comfort. So in short, the consolations of imagination are not at all imaginary constellations. And then finally, we have Oscar Wilde, who tells us that lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, is the proper aim of art. And probably Wilde also, you wouldn't connect him with fairy tales with this simple form at all, but he wrote these beautiful fairy tales, which actually still many of them are reprinted as in picture books today. So on the surface of these stories, we have what a character in Milan Kundera's The Unbearable Lightness of Being calls an intelligible lie. It is something supremely transparent, something that misrepresents, but is completely comprehensible. And what is underneath? Something different, something mysterious or abstract, what Kundera calls the unintelligible truth. And I think, because it's unintelligible, we have to keep talking about the story because we can never quite resolve it. So fairy tales, I think, are the simple expression of complex thought. On the surface, an intelligible lie, underneath the unintelligible truth. The genius of the fairy tale and of storytelling in general lies in its double nature as artifice. It reveals as it conceals, and it also satisfies our curiosity even as it arouses us and talks to us in order to get us thinking. So if you'll indulge me, I'll add one more voice to this chorus. And this is John Keats, who tells us about negative capability, the capacity to remain in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts. Fairy tales, I think, take us into that arena of negative capability. They defy logic and reason. They move us into the realm of indeterminacy. And they get us talking because they raise problems that really don't yield to an easy solution. So that by way of preface, just to think about what is at stake in stories, in the sites that I'm going to show you in a moment. So we'll take a brief tour of storytelling, beginning again with E.O. Wilson, The Social Conquest of Earth. And Wilson tells us that we managed to rise to the top of the food chain, for better or for worse. We managed to conquer the planet, mainly through the invention of fire. And once there was fire, humans started to build nests, what he called nests around these fires, and they started telling stories. Because wisdom, experience, useful knowledge could be encapsulated in a story and became memorable through the story. So it's the story that makes the human world, but also makes the world human. And here we have an early scene of storytelling. What's remarkable about this is that it doesn't look very animated. In part, I think, because of the representational practices of that time. The figures look a little stiff. But you can see what's interesting to me is that the genders are segregated and the women are carrying out household chores. Now imagine an era without electronic entertainments. What do you do at night? How do you make the time pass? Especially when they're boring chores to carry out. And you don't see them here, but spinning, sewing, repairing tools. It's always easier to do that to the rhythms of a story. So what fascinates me here is the couple in the middle section there. The woman with the spindle which will be connected with storytelling. And I think the two of them in some ways just embody the spirit of storytelling. But that may just be me. You do notice this multi-generational audience. And here now, suddenly, storytelling has migrated from the childhood of culture into the culture of childhood. And this is sort of the classic scene of storytelling. This is Perrault's, the frontispiece to Perrault's French collection of fairy tales, published in 1697, Tales of Mother Goose. And an older woman, a granny figure, possibly a household servant, telling the stories to these rather well-dressed children. And now we will move up another century to the first British translation of the Grimm's Kindle and Hausmärchen, Children's Stories and Household Tales, published in 1812, translated into English in 1823. And what do we see here but again the granny figure with the spinning wheel, again, the story is told to help time pass. She herself is not spinning, but you have a roaring fire, the idea of a hermetic space, a self-contained space. It's cozy. There's always a cat. I mean, it reminds me of the Booker script writers where they say you always gotta have a cat in your script. These illustrations all seem to have cats somewhere. And you generally get this kind of chiaroscuro play of light and dark because, of course, of the fire, shadows and light. This is the second frontispiece for the second volume. And you notice, of course, that here we have a male storyteller who's reading from a book. So the stories have migrated into print culture. They still have their hilarious aspect to them. And again, a multi-generational audience there. And then here's, I think, an important inflection point in the storytelling tradition. You can see the title of this is "And the Ogre Ate Him Up." Fortunately, there are not many fairy tales for children that end that way, although we'll look at a version of Little Red Riding Hood, which does end up with the girl being devoured by the wolf. But notice here, there's the book. There are the children clustered around the granny figure. And what is important to me is that raised finger. Suddenly we're in the realm of or else, what I talked about earlier, not what if, all the perils and possibilities. And how are you going to navigate your way out of the worst possible situation? This is what fairy tales tell us about. But now we're telling a cautionary tale. If you're curious, you're going to get in trouble. If you try to climb that beanstalk or do something like that, you won't survive it. So the tales have been instrumentalized to send a message, to teach a lesson. And then, worse yet, it's extraordinary to me that in this scene, 1867, we have again the pointed finger. I'm going to teach a lesson. The wonderful shadow, this very unrealistic shadow that is cast on the screen. But notice that everybody seems completely bored. Mirth has vanished. There's no laughter in this room. Nobody's really looking at her. The hearth is the focus. The Latin term for the hearth is focus. So you would expect all attention to be riveted on the storyteller. But to me, this illustrates perfectly how when you became too deeply invested in teaching a lesson, you lost the power of the story. It was flattened out in a way. And then finally, here we have just a scene in which you can see how storytelling has migrated into the bedroom. We're no longer at the communal, collective hearth. We're in the bedroom, the bourgeois bedroom, and it's probably an older sister. This is Seymour Joseph Guy, the story of Goldilocks. And it's called Goldilocks, it's Goldilocks. And the book is open to the page on which the bears return home. So she's trying to scare the two children in bed out of their wits. And this sort of scared element of fright has remained there with also the moral. And then finally, a picture of my kid. This was my first Kindle, so it's a photograph from many years ago. And it came in a box that not only had Once Upon a Time on it, but also sort of what was supposed to look like fairy dust in a way. So these new technologies tend to draw on older storytelling technologies. And I love the fact that it went from Kindle to Kindle Fire. And just to finish up this section, Kate DiCamillo on reading out loud, and I love the way she puts it. We exist together in a little patch of warmth and light. So I'm going to turn now to the big question about before going to Little Red Riding Hood, Beauty and the Beast, and Sleeping Beauty, big question about, why do these stories stick? What about this cultural repetition compulsion? Why do we keep telling them? And I should tell you that I started studying fairy tales at the moment when Bruno Bettelheim published his Uses of Enchantment, and sort of legitimized, and it was this extraordinary moment because well, first of all, he said, read these stories to your children, and it doesn't matter that they're violent. That's all right, because children are, Freud tells us, a seething cauldron of emotions, and fairy tales help to simmer things down a little bit. So stories have a therapeutic value. The dark side has a therapeutic value. And then, just as a footnote, Bettelheim then also legitimized the study of fairy tales in the academic world. So today, I have many disagreements with Bettelheim and with the developmental trajectory that he sees in fairy tales. But I still hold to the view that these symbolic stories do important cultural work. And they have what Paul Ricoeur refers to as ontological vehemence. They get us talking, they get us thinking more and moving in the optative mode about what could be, what should be, and what might be. And to explain ontological vehemence, I always use this for my students who get it immediately. When I use the example from Harry Potter when Dumbledore says, of course it's happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth should that mean that it's not real? And I love that, on earth. Why on earth should that mean that it's not real? So words, and in particular metaphors and symbols, have this kind of visceral hit, or they make a visceral hit as we're listening to them. And suddenly, I'm sure you've had many moments like this when you're reading, and it's not so much a light bulb going on, but suddenly you're immersed in that world and you feel what a character is feeling, or something like that. It feels as real as the world that you navigate on a daily basis. This past year, I was working on a collection of African-American folk tales. And one of the genres that I came across was something called the dilemma tale. So to give you an example of that, a boy is raised by a cruel biological father. He's a rat catcher who drives the boy away from home. First of all, he starves him practically, and then beats him, drives him out of the house. And the boy is subsequently adopted by a wealthy man who takes good care of him, educates him, dresses him well. And one day, the boy comes to a crossroads, and the adoptive father puts a sword in his hand and says, you have to, his biological father's there, the adoptive father's there, sword in hand, you have to kill one of us. Which one will it be? And that's the end of the story. So, you can see how, think back to those communal fireside scenes. These are stories that get us thinking, get us talking about, primal matters, nature or nurture, what is more important, and everybody can weigh in on that. It's hard not to do that. So, there are good reasons why these stories are still around. They give us counterfactuals that stimulate curiosity and then build community through conversation and make us care about values, basically. So the spirit of storytelling, I think, instinctively takes up our fears and desires. Or to use Claude Lévi-Strauss's term, it takes up cultural contradictions, strips them down to their core, and then reenacts those abstractions in a story. So just a quick little tutorial on Lévi, or what I find important, what has been valuable to me in Lévi-Strauss's work. And that is, first of all, he tells us all versions of a story belong to the myth. So he's not like Joseph Campbell, who says, oh, there are those fairy tales for children and then the myths for adults. But all versions belong to the myth. And then the myth is a logical model capable of overcoming a contradiction and mediating it, and I think fairy tales do that as well. And I love this. Man has always been thinking equally well. That is, those stories are, so extraordinary and deep everywhere. And he tells us that myth makers, this is the concept I raised earlier, they're bricoleurs, they're tinkerers, they put things together. And then myth thinks itself through the unconscious mind. I think I still don't quite get that, but it's quite extraordinary. And it tells us about, his quest. He's studying myth in order to understand how the human mind, how the brain works. So the logic of these stories, though, I think is always changing. Ezra Pound tells us that, what is his dictum? Make it new. And storytellers are always making it new. That's why a fairy tale like Little Red Riding Hood stays alive. We can never get that story right. We're always changing it, adapting it, recycling it, reinventing it, re-scripting it, and engaging in a kind of dizzying form of repetition compulsion. So make it new was, of course, a piece of advice you never had to give to the storytellers at the communal hearth, because they were always making it new and shamelessly cutting and pasting, but always improvising as well, so that their stories would tick and whir just as smoothly as the ones told the night before. The most skillful raconteurs, though, were the iconoclasts. They were able to preserve the tales and keep them alive, precisely because they were always trying to undo them and blow them up in one way or another. The way to kill a fairy tale is to keep telling the same old story, and it will die a natural death. But somehow, if you take it apart, pull it apart, undo its terms, I think you also keep it alive. So I want to look at some of those cultural contradictions in specific tales and turn first to Little Red Riding Hood, which takes up questions of innocence and seduction. So this has become our quintessential cautionary tale. I once went to a take your kids to work day, some Harvard administrators, and I thought, I'll bring different versions of Little Red Riding Hood. It was a bad idea because I'd forgotten that parents would not want to hear the Thurber story in which the little girl takes out a pistol and shoots the wolf. And then, well, we could go on because the NRA has now rewritten Little Red Riding Hood. Armed. And, oh, no problem. A wolf, no problem. Just take a. Well, yes. As I said, these stories give us a lot to talk about. So I was at this. I asked the kids, and they ranged from 2 to 14, which was hugely challenging for me. And the first thing I asked them was, "What is this story about?" And in a chorus, they replied, "Stranger danger." So they understood, that has become sort of our cultural story about that. So I wanted to take a look at the history of that story. And if you go back, some of you may know that the very early versions recorded by folklorists give us a little girl who meets the wolf. And the wolf gets to Granny's house first. He devours Granny. He puts her blood in a bottle and her flesh on a platter. Little Red Riding Hood comes in, drinks the wine, which he thinks is wine, eats the meat, and then goes to the wolf in bed and performs a little striptease. It's not what big eyes you have, but the wolf sort of gives us an inventory of all the items of clothing that she's wearing. And it's, you can take that off, you can take that off. She then gets into bed with the wolf. But she's no dumb bunny, as Anne Sexton tells us. And what does she do? She realizes it's a wolf. She says that she has to go outside to relieve herself. And finally persuades the wolf to let her out and runs back home. So she saves herself. She doesn't need a huntsman or anything like that. And you can see how that's the kind of story that could have been a big hit with adults as well as children who were learning about the facts of life. So You then have Charles Perrault taking up the story in 1697, as I said. And what is he doing? But he's giving us a moral. So suddenly we have this, children especially, not just one moral, but two. Ought never to talk to strangers. And then there's a second moral, which is this is not just a story about humans and beasts. It's not just about the predator-prey relationship. It's also about human beings who are worse than wolves. Wolves who seem perfectly charming, sweet-natured, and obliging, who pursue young girls, and these are the most dangerous beasts of all. So we move from the predator-prey relationship to the whole question of innocence and seduction. And then we get the Brothers Grimm, who move things a step farther. And Brothers Grimm, early 19th century, as I said, they wanted to create a manual of manners. So what did they do? They started out their Little Red Riding Hood with all kinds of lessons. There's kind of a barrage of lessons. And so what does Mother do? She says, here are cakes, start off, be the early bird, look straight ahead, don't stray from the path, and don't forget to say good morning, and don't go poking into all the corners of the house. In other words, don't be curious, which is something that no one in the 19th century seems to have wanted to promote in children. So if you look at, here's the ending of the Grimm's Little Red Riding Hood. Never again will you stray from the path and go into the woods when your mother has forbidden it. Important because if you look at picture books published today, and I've looked at dozens of them, you find that it's the same old message. Never again. Here's this gothic, sort of grown-up Little Red Riding Hood. Never again will you stray from the path. Trina Schardt-Hyman, who is normally a kind of iconoclast, ends with, I won't wander. I should have kept my promise to Mother. So I could go on and on with this, but as the antidote, Neil Gaiman again, adults follow paths, children explore. And I was a child, which meant that I knew a dozen different ways of getting out of our property, ways that would not involve walking down the drive. So, in fact, we sort of welcome that exploratory urge. We want children today to stray from within limits, obviously. So if the Grimms were zealous about recruiting the tales for moral purpose, we are even more zealous. And just to, I think Foucault helps us understand exactly what happened, because he tells us about an age of sexual repression that began in the early 17th century and continued up through the 20th century. And he tells us that in earlier times, a certain frankness was still common. So what does he do? He describes a carnivalesque atmosphere with direct gestures, shameless discourse, and open transgressions where knowing children hung about amid the laughter of adults. It was a period when bodies made a display of themselves. So there's kind of a lack of inhibition. And, as I read that last night, I was thinking that, are we coming back to that in a way via the internet, where children have so much access to things. So with the installation of a bourgeois social order came an injunction of silence. Utter silence became the norm between children and adults when it came to sexual matters. What's interesting is that Foucault then identifies the exact opposite phenomenon at the level of adult discursive practices about sex. Because from the 17th century onward, there's a steady proliferation of discourses concerned with sex, all radiating from sites of power, each talking endlessly about sex. So that even a story like Little Red Riding Hood doesn't escape the constant chatter about sex. So we find that these adult versions today give us a hypersexualized Little Red Riding Hood. Here's an illustration from a French adult version of the story. It's a little hard to read that, but you can see the wolf up there in the long shadowy casts. And then some of you may know Tex Avery's Red Hot Riding Hood. You know, it's a cartoon, but it's obviously, and I rewatched it last night with his roommate, it's for adults. Little Red Riding Hood is a burlesque entertainer. Grandma pursues the wolf. Grandma becomes the lascivious one. So, and then we have entertainments like Little Red Riding Crop, and on the bottom right there you see an ad for aftershave lotion. So an elated girl in red goes motoring off with the wolf. And Hollywood has gone on to Little Red Riding Hood very early on. This was have any of you seen Freeway? Oh, you're lucky. It's pretty unbearable. And I think Reese Witherspoon would probably prefer that no one ever saw this film. But it's a twisted take on Little Red Riding Hood. She's a juvenile delinquent, and she's trying to get to grandmother's house while being hounded by a charming but sadistic serial killer, pedophile, shrink. And his name is Bob Wolverton. So we then have something like Hard Candy with Ellen Page playing the innocent, but she's not so innocent, and she turns the tables on the predator in a truly horrifying way. And Hannah, Joe writes Hannah, where we have a genetically modified teenage assassin who is being raised in the woods by her father. And what does she do at night? She reads the Grimm's fairy tales, a bloodstained copy of, and I think Little Red Riding Hood is right in there, one of the first ones she looks at. Then she goes to her grandmother's house and meets up with somebody at the house of Wilhelm Grimm. So there are all these fairy tale allusions embedded in there. And then we have celebrities who've seen, innocence and seduction. We have sort of become the predator. They are the seductive innocents. And these are just 3 random ones. You can find many more celebrities doing this. And so we have this pivot toward accepting the fact that we're the predators. The beast is innocent, especially now that we're at the top of the food chain and can outwit all those predators. So just quickly, just a few minutes on our other stories. First, Beauty and the Beast, which takes up a range of binaries. Remember those cultural contradictions. A range of binaries from the nature-culture divide to self and other. It asks questions about our relationship to alterity, to the other. How do we represent monstrosity? How do we respond to it? With rage, hostility, fear, or with compassion, admiration, charity, sympathy, understanding? Is hospitality, one of my favorite words, Derrida uses it to capture both hostility and hospitality. The way that when we're hosts, we always have a kind of mix of them. I won't explore that one too far. So hospitality, I think, is something that is really taken up in the Beauty and the Beast story. And how do we understand the volatile mix of passions evoked in encounters between beauties and beasts? This is a story that is overdetermined. It has so many different sources. We could go back to the Greek stories about Zeus and Europa, Leda and the Swan, and so on, and so forth. But this is a story that could also just take up the whole fear of marriage, anxieties about arranged marriages. You were, as a 14-year-old, you were going to marry a beastly 40-year-old. And the horror of marriage in general. because humans are like beasts in a way. That is, sex is beastly and turns us into animals. So we're back to the human-animal question. And today I think fairy tales are taking up the human-machine question. So if you've seen Ex Machina, that is a film that works out, using the story of Bluebeard, works out our relationships to machines. In any case, so here we have Europa. I think I'll just abbreviate this a little bit and take a look at the afterlife of Beauty and the Beast, because it kind of took, here I think Disney, of course you can always critique Disney and find so many things to hate in the films, but I'm always grateful for the fact that Disney kept fairy tales alive in the 20th century and continues to rework them, and then gets us talking. What is wrong with the Disney version? And here I think Disney does get something right in that after the transformation, how does Beauty react? She misses Beast. We see it in her eyes that she sort of wants this charismatic creature back. And then of course we have something like a Shrek where the Beast is the privileged figure. So, well, we could look at a whole range of stories from the Pig King, told in 17th century Italy, a story that is full of violence. The Pig King kills his first two wives with his hooves, and then is only redeemed by the third one. And then we have the Grimm's Frog Prince. But again, so many different, we looked at the Disney versions, who made Shrek? DreamWorks? Was it DreamWorks? Here more, this is Beauty and the Beast for teens. And notice, again, how the Beast has morphed into someone beautiful. Actually his body art, his tattoos make him attractive, and then we only see half of her face, so there's a dark side that is missing there. We have Wolf with Jack Nicholson and Michelle Pfeiffer, and the amazing La Belle et la Bête, made in France after the Second World War. So, so let's just move to Sleeping Beauty.
Well, now what's the name of the older movie?
Oh, it's La Belle et la Bête, Jean Cocteau, Beauty and the Beast. So it's just the same title. Well, here's another, this is an ad. Fashion magazines love fairy tales. And you can see here that the Beast is completely tame. So finally, I want to move to Sleeping Beauty. And the title actually is a kind of oxymoron. It yokes together two figures of speech. The heroine is a woman who is invested with the power to arouse and awaken desire, but she's also out of sight, slumbering and unavailable. Also, fairy tales are full of melodrama and action, and this is one that has no narrative energy at all, Sleeping Beauty. It becomes purely visual. The temporal aspect just drops out. Time is arrested, and we have a tableau that gives us death, and in this case, lack of decay. The beauty of Sleeping Beauty is that she stays exactly the same and will not change, that she has a kind of immortality. In some ways, it's tragic that she wakes up because she's then destined to enter this temporal dimension. Fascinating, though, if you go back to the earlier versions, you find that Sleeping Beauty is discovered in Italy by a king, and she continues to sleep while the king reaps the fruits of love. And 9 months later, Sleeping Beauty wakes up because she's giving birth, she has 2 children. So it was actually Perrault who strengthened the link between sleep and death in his story of Sleeping Beauty. So the beautiful dead woman captures the essence of the tale. And I mean, this is extraordinary. You can see how death and sleep are aestheticized here with this ornate bed, intricately woven tapestries, carved columns, all standing in the service of elevating and adorning the princess, who's lying in a truly regal state. But we can't really tell whether it's her bed or a sarcophagus. In fact, I think it looks a little bit more like a sarcophagus. Today, Sleeping Beauty can be found in many different variations here we have Aurora in Disney's animated cartoon, to then the eponymous character in Anne Rice's Sleeping Beauty trilogy. And the suppressed theme of necrophilia comes back with a vengeance in that trilogy. And there's this wonderful moment in Mad Men where one of the admen talks about, they want to use fairy tales to sell shoes, and he says, I always thought they were more about necrophilia than shoes. So the tale has been resurrected and is constantly refashioned. Here we have some different versions. Of course, many of you probably know Maleficent. And then on the lower left, Almodovar's Talk to Her, where we get 2 sleeping beauties. And then finally, there are always surprises. Django. I mean, who would think Quentin Tarantino and fairy tales? But what is the name of Django's wife? Brunhilde. Brunhilde was one of the earliest Sleeping Beauties, surrounded by a ring of fire. Wotan put a ring of fire around her, and there was a sleep thorn lodged in her thumb. And how does Django rescue her? She's in a sleep box underground, and he has to literally unearth her and bring her back from the dead. So Sleeping Beauty, with her magnetic beauty, invites risk-free voyeurism, and she remains a hauntingly seductive figure in our cultural imaginary, reminding us of the nexus of femininity, beauty, and death. But we should talk to her, as Pedro Almodovar advises us in his Sleeping Beauty film, and also talk with each other about the uses of enchantment. And I'll just close with Einstein, who tells us, this is apocryphal, you can read a whole Wikipedia page on this. Did he really say this or not? But 2 people reported that he said this in conversation. If you want intelligent children, read them fairy tales. And if you want more intelligent children, read them more fairy tales. Thanks so much.
Turn it over for question and answer. I guess we'll be okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Anyone who wants to kick it off?
So, some of the political correctness of the days, for example, this, which is Caldecott, or the days, which is awful or logical. Do you see any, in the future, what will translate, what do you think to actually sort of more consequences that don't end up with everyone as unicorns and rainbows?
Yeah. Well, there's that wonderful volume, Politically Incorrect Fairy Tales by James Van Garner. And well, I don't mind, but the only fairy tale I don't like is the NRA one. The politically correct ones, I actually find it really interesting because we start responding and reacting to the message. And often when there's a strong moral, the kids are so great at smelling a moral and running in the opposite direction. They're sort of contrarians. So, I tend not to worry about, is it politically correct? I mean, there was the dreadful, another exception to the rule, the live-action Cinderella film that Disney made about a year ago, where, her waist was, the live-action figure had a thinner waist than the animated Cinderella. And it was, she kept repeating mantra like, I must be kind and gentle or something. No, you have to be smart and courageous. I was kind and courageous, but I thought it should be courageous and brainy instead. But again, we've got this built-in resistance to the story. That's not the way I heard it. Could also be, that's not the way I want to hear it, and that's not the way I want to tell it. So I love the fact that there's so many different versions, and we can play them off against each other.
Yes, the Lady Strauss quote is so true. I'm a vampire expert, and I don't know how many times I have talked to people about vampires, about the New England vampire belief, and then had someone say, but those aren't real vampires. And I just look at them and say, and what is a real vampire? And in the same way, whenever we talk about different versions of fairy tales, somebody in the audience will say, well, that's not how I heard it,
Yeah.
and that therefore it's not the real version.
Yeah. So many people are onto vampires these days, and I sometimes get the question, why vampires? Can you give I sort of thought it was because they were about mortality.
Well, they're overdetermined.
They're overdetermined, yeah, right.
The New England folkloric belief, I don't know if you, we'll have to talk about it.
Yeah.
Is quite different from the sexy vampire. In fact, all the world folkloric vampires. I think that the prevalence of vampires is precisely because it's the literary Gothic archetype rather than the folkloric vampire.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I sort of feel guilty about putting that question too, because I think of Errol Morris, the filmmaker. I heard him on an interview just the other day, and the interviewer said, can you tell us what the takeaway is? In one sentence, can you give us the takeaway from your film, The Known Unknowns? And Errol was not kind in his response. He just said, the takeaway? That is, it's hard to come up with a one-liner, and we shouldn't come up with the soundbite or the one-liner.
But
so
certainly
overdetermined, I like.
And many of the vampire, current vampire fiction you have up there, they're retellings of Beauty and the Beast rather than the more traditional vampire.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great point. The link between those two stories, which are about monstrosity, compassion, and all those complicated things that, yeah.
And sex and death.
Sex and death, right. Love and death, yeah.
Here's a question.
Oh, yes.
It seems we spend a lot of time thinking about the girl and the wolf, Little Red Riding Hood, but why is she going to a grandmother?
Oh, good question.
And the grandmother, we never seem to fixate on the grandmother because she dies so quickly.
Yeah, and she has sort of a minor role, and you do have this sort of bookending of the mother and the grandmother. So the mother's sending her out into, why is she sending her out into the woods when she knows it's, why isn't she going, I mean, fairy tales are never logical. That's why, we want to know what's next, what's going to happen next. So I think that actually, the wolf gets the lion's share, as it were, of the attention. And there is something going on in generational exchanges. That is renewal, birth, death, renewal. Little Red Riding Hood replacing the grandmother in a sense, and we do have bread and wine in that basket often, so the sacrament and blood and flood, well, vampires back again. And yeah, so generational shifts. There was another idea that was rolling into my head, which I've lost now. But yeah, I think that I think that, and remember, these were stories that once had multi-generational audiences, so they're all listening and thinking about their roles. And then it's a story about maturation, becoming like your mother, and that kind of thing. Yeah. Oh, I know, the Alessa was Angela Carter, read Angela Carter and her Company of Wolves, which does bring the whole question of multiple generations into the story and captures the hostility toward the grandmother as well. Yeah.
Well, in all of these three stories, some of these, I don't know, protagonist is the right word, but the main focus is really on the female character. She's in sort of the central focus in terms of how is she dealing with the situation.
Right.
Was there a feminization in some ways of fairy tales, or is this, or how do you explain this? Or is this sort of something you see over and over, in some sense that female characters sort of
Yeah. I think when you get that migration into the nursery, you also have to kind of move from, storytellers, male and female storytellers, to women telling the stories to young children. And actually, what is astonishing is when you go back to the 19th century collections or try to recover some of the stories that have not been canonized, because you're right, it's Sleeping Beauty, Beauty and the Beast, Little Red Riding. You go on, and then finally you get, well, Jack and the Beanstalk, okay? But almost the exception to the rule of, the 15 really big stories. If you look at the older, because there's so many stories about toxic fathers who kick out their sons, stories about 3 sons, rather than, Cinderella and the stepsisters. And, I think that, it would be great to bring some of those stories back. Why have they lost their power? Is it because fairy tales were associated with the nursery? And then, we have that term, old wives' tales, okay? So, and not just for children, but they were told by grandmothers and old women, which I think puts them even lower on the hierarchy of storytelling. And or that's how things went. So I think it is time to kind of start looking for varied patterns. Maybe there are actually in our modern entertainments Cinderellas that we just haven't quite recognized yet. And there's that great Jerry Lewis film. Dumb and Dumber. Yeah. Remember? They're going to the ball. And they have the makeover scene, that really wacky makeover scene. So it is a kind of refashioned, but parody. Yeah, you have
I noticed and was surprised by your retelling of the original, I guess it was the original Red Riding Hood. She seemed like almost a feminist character. That there's sexuality and she escapes and she's kind of strong, but then I've always felt like the newer versions are really practically misogynistic, that they're about how she looks, about getting married, being saved by men. I'm curious if how that has changed over time to be less feministic, or
It's interesting. Are you thinking of Catherine Hardwicke's Red Riding Hood, or?
I wasn't familiar enough with it other than your telling.
Oh,
Where
yeah.
You described how she has like a little striptease and then ended up figuring out those wolves and escapes, but wasn't saved by somebody.
What? I think there's a move now to a kind of warrior woman archetype. So we've gone from, the sweet, innocent girl who's negotiating the path between mother and grandmother, gone through an initiation rite in a way. And then think I forgot to mention in Pavlo's version, I referred to it very briefly, the girl actually dies. And that's a story that is read to French children today. So it's still inflected in so many ways, but somehow I think now we've got this warrior woman archetype. So Little Red Riding Hood can rescue herself in a way. She doesn't need the hunter. The huntsman, who is a kind of more of a father figure actually than, I mean, are you thinking, you mentioned marriage. Are there versions of Little Red Riding Hood where we actually see her?
I don't know specifically that one, but I do know I always hated the Sleeping Beauty or Cinderella, because their goal in life is to get married.
Oh,
And
yeah,
that's where it ends.
right.
And she did not have a.
Well, once again, the genius of Disney in Frozen, something like Frozen, which focuses on bonding between sisters rather than the love relationship. So, the question is Disney reflecting us, or are they shaping us? What kind of relationship is going on there?
I was thinking, if you go back to what you said earlier about they're doing cultural work, they're doing the work of the culture. So the sanitization of the fairy tales, right? And this idea of, the male as beast, the sexual beast that is going to be domesticated by the pure female, which is a trope that's still alive today. But it struck me also, we choose what fairy tales we keep, right, on some level. So I remember years ago reading a collection called Tatamalian, which was a collection of fairy tales from this exact same period, Perrault and Brothers Grimm, where the female figure was actually had tremendous agency and resisted the marriage narrative, et cetera. But no, they're not the ones that are taken up by our culture. Perhaps those
exactly,
will change. They will be, right? These are rewrites, the overt rewrites of real life.
And you have anthologies sort of in the 70s and 80s, the Maid of the North, the Virago Book of Fairy Tales, Fearless Women and Feisty Girls, these anthologies. What I was astonished by was the lack of success in that they really never made it into the mainstream, and they didn't become our story. No filmmakers were looking to those collections for ideas. And so I asked myself, why did they not resonate? What is it that, makes vampires so culturally relevant today? But, something like Catskin. I mean, Catskin, that figure that I showed on the very first slide, she has a pelt of many different furs, many different animals. What is she doing? She's fleeing a home where her father wants to marry her. So, this, obviously we don't want to tell that story to kids today about, an incestuous, a possible incestuous. It's easier to have a toxic mother than a father who wants to marry his daughter. She is then the enterprising heroine because she goes out into the world and she finds a way out and again, lives happily ever after, puts on beautiful dresses, looks good, dances, cooks well. But again, that kind of mirrors what you needed for success a century ago. Did you?
I'm just wondering, how does, this message, it seems like today there's so much concern about what children are exposed to, and I would imagine there's a lot of, even awareness on parents about, children being exposed to violence and narrative. So I'm just wondering, when you give talks like this, or you try to send this message that this is an intrinsic part of fairy tales and valuable, how do you see that kind of playing out today?
It depends, of course, on the age, and I kind of think, my own experience was reading The Juniper Tree. I thought, oh boy, I can combine my professional life and my personal interests by reading my kids the Grimm's fairy tales. So I get to The Juniper Tree, where the mother decapitates her stepson, chops him up in a stew, serves him up to the father, you know. And I'm madly trying to edit, and of course, my daughter was older than my son, immediately knew I was editing, so, you know, what do you do? And you know, there's no formula for the 5-year-old or the 3-year-old or the 7, because every child is different. So at that age where you're still, you know, kind of in a protective, I mean, there is that sort of, we don't want to protect too much, but obviously we have to protect. And we have to watch the child. Do they like it? Do they think it's funny? Do they want to hear more? Or are they shut? Kids are great at shutting down. When, I remember taking my kids to see Batman. Everybody said, oh, go take them to Batman. Scene 1, the parents are shut. And I'm thinking, how do I get the kids out of the theater? Guess what they did? They fell asleep. They fell asleep. I mean, you know, it's so they know, and so it's so, you know, that whole interaction. I mean, that's why these stories are so important, because they create a contact zone between adult and child. And so then, of course, what happens later? And there again, I would say, kids know what they're ready for. At the same time, you know, we have this, we don't talk much about this, but gosh, there's so much stuff out there. And how do you, when I think of being a parent today, sorry, you know, I've never been a protectionist. I've never been anything goes, but, you know, I kind of think there's a lot of stuff out there that you do have to kind of, and kids will resist laws, rules too, you know, so. Yeah, well, you all know as well as I do.
It makes me think of the stroke teacher, the doctor taught these cautionary tales, because he didn't want the fairy tales.
Right.
So he wrote about the girl who played with matches and ended up burning herself to death, or the boy who would eat his food and ended up starving to death.
Right, okay, so we're in 19th century Germany, and a pediatrician decides, oh, but, you know, the poor children are getting bored in my reading room. I think I'll write a book for them. So, you know, Pauline plays with matches. And then the next scene, we see her ashes, her tombstone. But the worst one is, and many German men have told me they were totally traumatized by a book that is still a bestseller today. Conrad, who sucks his thumb. His mother goes out, runs errands. Don't suck your thumbs, Conrad. She leaves, puts his thumb in his mouth, and this man comes with these gigantic scissors and lops off his thumb. And then you see the bloody stumps there. So why has this been the all-time best-selling children's book? Well, partly the subtitle was hilarious pictures and funny stories. And this grotesque over-the-top humor, I think, sometimes. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, well, this is what makes the field so interesting. But I know you had lunch. What have you done for lunch? You had a question.
I just had a comment on fairy tale violence versus, you know, what we have now in videos and things. And I think, you know, in a story, the child's imagination will take it as far as they want to.
Yeah.
But when it's in front of you with real people, it seems a little more real. And so I would think the fairy tale violence might not be as violent as something that's staring them in front of the face with real people.
Yeah.
Their imagination, there's nothing left to the imagination, it's right there in front of you. Whereas if you hear the words, you can kind of.
Oh, yeah, and I do think that those magical words, once upon a time, oh God, I got an email from Jeff Blue this morning with fairy travels, F-A-R-E, and then it's doing, oh, once upon, you know, using all the fairy tale, sort of, I don't know, somehow when it appears in ads, it bothers me, but yeah, so once upon a time establishes a sort of safe space. And I completely agree, you know, obviously words are, you know, somehow, well, the image image is so powerful and is going to stay with you, and you're more likely to keep reenacting that, maybe in a good way. But there is something, and we're moving into a visual storytelling culture. But I think bringing back the story and letting children use their imaginations to either tamp things down or make them even more scary in a way.
At their own level. with the
Yeah,
audience.
yeah. I think it was Calvino who said that the story becomes interesting, not because of the story, but because of what you add to it. So, you know, and again, it makes your brain work much more than the visual image, which kind of puts it all out there. So it leaves much less to the imagination.
And I think as much as devastating here for children with these stories is the sense that I can conquer this.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, right. I can process it, I can take it in, and.
And maybe they don't even understand that.
No, but it puts them on the path to knowledge, you know, which is obviously what we want, curiosity, stimulating the curiosity, and, yeah, again, you know, there's so much that they read, they only get 2/3 of it, but like Jabberwocky, where we don't understand half the words in there, but we still have a narrative, that we can fill in the gaps.
I remember we even started sort of framing children's fairy tales, you know, using this frame of violence and this label of violence to describe these stories. And you know, if you any sense of that historically when we started.
You know, that's fascinating, because in a way, it was Bettelheim, who oddly, with the uses of enchantment, magic, and all of that, drove home the point that the stories are really full of violence and scary stuff. So that association, I think, is imprinted on it. That is what's our first thought about fairy tales? Oh, dark side, grim. I love the fact that the Grimms have the perfect name. Grim, violent, but then again, you know, it's always part of the story because they're so melodramatic. I mean, we keep listening because they've got good and evil. There is so much dark stuff, but also so much hope and promise and transformation. And all of those things that Neil Gaiman talked about in that quote.
There's a common complaint nowadays that in the media, violence is acceptable, but sexuality is highly censored. Is that something that you would say is consistent?
Sorry, can you say that a little louder?
Sorry. It's a complaint I hear pretty often that in media, television, that there's rampant violence, but sexuality is very censored. Is that something that is also true in fairy tales? Like I'm hearing lots of blood and guts for kids, but not romance for kids.
Oh, yeah, you know, I took a flight to Los Angeles a few weeks ago, and I was going to a meeting at Disney Junior to talk about, you know, what's in the future, just to brainstorm, and, you know, there was nothing on the TV, so I decided to do some homework and watch children's cartoons. You know, it was awful. It was, I mean, I was shocked. And, these weren't Disney channels, as it turns out, but they were wildly violent, as they were when I was growing up. You know, so it's no different in a way. But worse than that, they were really boring. And, you know, the fact that I think that, you know, a good children's book will get an adult hooked as much as a child. And, you know, you want to watch it, and that's what creates the contact zone in a way. So I think those two, adult culture and children's culture, I think mirror each other in the way that you just described. And yet, you know, there's all this leakage that seeps through because, you know, you have Little Red Riding Crop and all of these, you know, pornographic fairy tales that circulate that, you know, in a hidden, you know, we don't talk about those. I'm not talking, you know, I don't want to go watch those and then talk about them. So our own repression and then our cultural repression